The claim appeared in survey records as a matter of obstruction, not legend. It was filed alongside reports of impassable gorges, unstable slopes, and timber too dense for measurement. The language was procedural. The surveyors wrote that certain parcels in the western hills could not be accurately mapped due to interference that exceeded the tolerance of their instruments, and, more critically, their ability to verify consistent ground elevation. They did not call it a creature. They called it an impediment. They marked the affected sections with notations that indicated work had been postponed indefinitely, pending conditions they did not describe. The year was 1071. Land surveying was not romantic work. It was a function of expansion, taxation, and legal clarity. Surveyors were hired by state offices, railroad companies, and land development firms to measure and record what had previously been ignored or misrepresented. They worked in teams of 3 to 5, moving through terrain that ranged from tedious to hostile, and their findings determined where roads would be cut, where towns might be founded, and where resources could be extracted. Their reports were read by investors and engineers, not storytellers. If something prevented them from completing their task, it needed to be named in terms that justified the delay and protected their credibility. That is why the claim stands out. It was not dramatic. It was cautious and exact. It acknowledged something that should not have been there, something large enough to distort their work, but it did so without embellishment. The surveyors did not seek attention. They sought release from obligation. They wanted the land reassigned. No folklore accompanied the report. No tradition was cited. The claim was notable precisely because it appeared alone, disconnected from any inherited story. It implied direct encounter, not rumor. The men who wrote it had degrees from technical schools or years of apprenticeship. They understood angles, distances, and the behavior of light across open ground. They knew how to compensate for atmospheric distortion and seasonal variation. They understood what belonged in a landscape and what did not. What they described did not belong. Surveying in the 1870s required a particular kind of attention. The work was methodical, repetitive, and dependent on clear sightlines. A crew would begin at a known reference point, often a county marker or a prominent natural feature, and extend their measurements outward using chains, rods, and transits. Each distance was checked twice. Each angle was recorded in field books with notations about weather, time of day, and ground composition. Errors accumulated quickly if discipline faltered, so the men worked in near silence, calling out numbers only when necessary. They rose early, often before dawn, to take advantage of cooler temperatures and softer light. Mornings offered the best visibility. Haze burned off by mid-morning, and the crew could see for miles if the terrain allowed it. They would establish a sight line to a distant feature, a lone tree, a rock outcrop, a ridge, and measure toward it in increments. The lead surveyor walked ahead with the chain. The rear surveyor held the previous marker. The transit operator remained stationary, watching through the scope to ensure the line stayed true. It was work that demanded trust. A crew had to believe in the stability of what they were observing. Landmarks could not move. Distances could not change. The ground beneath them had to remain fixed. Anything that violated those assumptions made the work impossible. They encountered the usual hazards. Thunderstorms could erase a day's progress if field books were soaked. Rattlesnakes appeared in tall grass. Blackflies made the men's faces swell in the summer months. Equipment broke. Men twisted ankles on uneven ground. These were expected. These were accounted for. But there were things that could not be accounted for, disruptions that fell outside the known parameters of surveying work. When those occurred, the protocol was simple. Note the irregularity, attempt to resolve it, and if resolution was impossible, report the section as incomplete. It was rare. Most land, no matter how difficult, eventually yielded to measurement. The hills in question had not. The crew assigned to the Western Territory had been working for 3 weeks when the first inconsistencies appeared. They were experienced men. 2 had worked on railroad surveys through the Rocky Mountains. Another had mapped coastal boundaries in Maine. They were not easily unsettled. They understood the difference between difficult terrain and impossible terrain. What they encountered in the western hills fell into neither category. It was something else entirely. The land responded to their presence in ways that should not have been possible. Measurements failed to hold. Reference points disappeared. The hills themselves seemed to resist documentation, not through physical obstruction, but through behavior that violated every principle their work was built upon. The inconsistencies began as small errors that should not have occurred. A ridge that measured 400 yards from the base camp appeared to be 500 yards the following morning. The surveyors rechecked their measurements. They repositioned the transit. They retraced their steps. The distance did not stabilize. It varied each time they attempted to confirm it, sometimes growing longer, sometimes shorter, never by a negligible amount. They moved to a different section of the valley, thinking the issue might be localized to a single feature. The problem followed them. Landmarks they had used as reference points the previous day were no longer where they should have been. A lightning-struck oak that had stood prominently on the western slope now seemed to be farther south, or perhaps lower in elevation. The surveyors could see it clearly. There was no fog, no distortion from heat. The air was still. But the tree refused to align with their notes. One of the men suggested the maps they had been given were inaccurate. Another thought their compass might be affected by iron deposits in the soil. They tested both theories. The maps matched other verified sections. The compass behaved normally when taken a quarter mile in any direction. The problem was not with their tools. It was with the land itself. Shadows persisted in places where the sun should have eliminated them. Not shadows cast by trees or boulders, but broad, diffuse patches of darkness that stretched across open slopes without a clear source. The surveyors noted them in their field books, describing the angles and approximate dimensions, but they could not explain why the shadows remained stationary even as the sun moved. At first, they assumed it was a trick of perspective, some quirk of the terrain that absorbed light differently. But the effect did not change with the time of day. One surveyor wrote that the ground felt wrong, not unstable in the sense of loose soil or hidden sinkholes, but wrong in proportion. He described walking toward a hilltop that seemed a reasonable distance away, perhaps half an hour's climb, and finding that after an hour of steady movement, the summit appeared no closer. He stopped, turned back, and reached the base camp in 15 minutes. The return was faster than it should have been. The ascent had taken 4 times longer than expected. He was not the only one who noticed. Another member of the crew experienced the same distortion while attempting to measure a southern slope. He paced out a distance 3 times, each time arriving at a different count. The variance was not slight. The first count was 320 paces. The second was 410. The third was 270. He checked his stride. He checked his footing. Nothing had changed in his method. Only the distance had changed. They began to suspect that the land was not behaving according to natural law. That was not a conclusion they reached easily. These were practical men, trained in mathematics and geometry. They did not believe in haunted ground or cursed valleys. But they also could not deny what they were documenting. The terrain was rejecting measurement. It was rejecting them. The surveyors began to compare notes without prompting. There was no formal meeting, no decision to gather and discuss. It simply happened. One evening, after the day's work had been abandoned earlier than usual, the men sat near the fire and began to speak in low tones about what they had seen. Or rather, what they had not been able to measure. No one argued. No one dismissed the observations as fatigue or misperception. The agreement was immediate and unsettling. Each man had experienced the same failures. Each had noticed the same spatial distortions. Each had felt the same reluctance to continue working in certain directions. They were trained to be precise, and precision required consistency. What they were encountering was not consistent, but it was shared. That made it worse. One of them suggested they recalibrate their instruments from the beginning, start over with fresh reference points, and ignore the previous week's data. The others agreed, not because they believed it would help, but because the alternative was to admit that the land could not be surveyed. They spent 2 days reworking their initial measurements, confirming distances they had already verified. Everything matched. The problem was not in what they had done before. The problem was still there. They moved their base camp closer to the hills. It was a decision made out of stubbornness more than strategy. If they could not measure the land from a distance, they would measure it up close. They packed their equipment and relocated to a flat clearing near the base of the largest ridge, a broad slope covered in sparse vegetation and loose stone. From there, they had a clear view of the higher elevations. That night, none of them slept well. The silence was too complete. They were used to the sounds of the wilderness, crickets, wind, the occasional cry of a distant animal. But here, there was nothing. The fire crackled, and beyond that the world was still. In the morning, they noticed the equipment had been moved. Not stolen, not damaged, but shifted. The transit, which had been set up facing east, now faced north. The chains, which had been coiled and secured, were stretched out in a line pointing toward the ridge. No one had touched them during the night. No one had risen from their bedrolls. They did not discuss it. They reset the equipment and began their work. The day proceeded without incident until late afternoon, when one of the surveyors called for the others to stop. He was staring at his field book, his expression blank. He had been recording elevations for the past hour, and when he reviewed his notes, he found that every measurement was identical, every single one. The numbers had not changed despite the fact that they had been working across varied terrain, moving uphill and down, crossing gullies and rises. According to his notes, the elevation had remained exactly the same for over a mile. He showed the book to the others. They examined it. The handwriting was his. The numbers were clear. There was no explanation. One of the men suggested they abandon the section and move east, toward flatter ground where the distortions might be less severe. Another said they should return to the settlement and request a different assignment. A third said nothing. He simply walked to the edge of the clearing and looked up toward the ridge. He stood there for a long time. When he finally turned back, his face was pale. He said that something was standing on the slope above them. He said it had been there for several minutes, watching. The others joined him. They looked where he pointed. At first, they saw nothing. Then the light shifted, and the shape became clear. The locals had said very little. When the surveyors first arrived in the nearest settlement to purchase supplies and arrange for pack animals, they were met with polite indifference. The townsfolk were accustomed to surveying crews passing through. They sold what was needed and answered questions about trails and water sources, but when asked about the hills to the west, their answers became vague. One shopkeeper mentioned that the ground up there was unreliable. He did not elaborate. When pressed, he said only that previous crews had found the work difficult and that the hills were better left alone. Another man, older, warned them not to camp on the ridges. He said the slopes shifted, that a man could lose his footing without warning. His tone was not concerned. It was flat, as though he were reciting something he had been told long ago and no longer questioned. The surveyors took it as exaggeration. Hill country was often difficult. People who lived near it developed superstitions, small fears that made the isolation more tolerable. It was easier to say the land was cursed than to admit it was simply hard to live in. But after the equipment was moved, one of the surveyors returned to the settlement. He did not go for supplies. He went to ask more direct questions. He found the older man sitting outside a stable mending a harness. The surveyor asked if anyone had ever mapped the western hills successfully. The man did not look up. He said that some had tried. He did not say whether they had finished. When the surveyor asked why the hills were avoided, the man paused, set down his work, and finally met his eyes. "Because something is already there," he said. The surveyor asked what he meant. The man picked up his work again and did not answer. The conversation was over. When the surveyor returned to camp and relayed what had been said, the others did not laugh. They did not dismiss it. They simply added it to the list of things that did not fit. Over the next few days, they noticed other signs of avoidance. Trails that approached the western hills would veer away before reaching the ridgeline, even when the terrain ahead was passable. Hunters they encountered in the valley mentioned that game was scarce near the high ground, though they could not explain why. One trapper, when asked if he had ever set lines in the hills, said he had tried once and would not do so again. He did not offer a reason. He simply moved on. The surveyors began to understand that the avoidance was not superstition. It was practiced. It was learned. The people who lived in the region had developed an unspoken boundary, a line they did not cross, and they maintained it without fanfare or explanation. It was simply part of how they lived. That realization unsettled the surveyors more than the distortions in their measurements. Distortions could be investigated, tested, potentially understood. But a collective, wordless agreement to avoid an entire section of land suggested something far more serious. It suggested that others had already learned what the surveyors were only beginning to suspect. The land was not empty. The first time the obstruction moved, it was late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the valley. The surveyors were working near the base of the ridge, attempting once again to verify the elevation of the slope. One of them glanced up toward the summit and stopped. The ridgeline had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that could be easily described, but the shape was different. Where there had been a smooth, rounded crest, there was now an irregularity, a raised section that had not been there an hour before. It was not a trick of the light. The sun was behind them. The ridge was clearly visible. He called to the others. They looked. They saw it too. They watched for several minutes. The shape did not move again, but it did not need to. The fact that it had moved once was enough. They returned to camp without finishing the day's work. That night, they debated whether to continue. One man argued that they had been contracted to complete the survey, and that leaving would mean forfeiting payment. Another said that payment meant nothing if they could not produce accurate maps. A third pointed out that they were not being asked to investigate or explain the obstruction, only to work around it. But they could not work around it. It was too large. It covered too much ground. And it was becoming clearer that the obstruction was not terrain. The next day, they saw it again. This time it was farther south, positioned on a different section of the ridge. It had not moved while they were watching. It had simply appeared in a new location, as though it had always been there. The surveyors marked the position in their notes, measured the distance as best they could, and moved to another area. The shape followed them. On the third day, one of the surveyors decided to observe the ridgeline continuously for an entire hour. He set up the transit, focused on the highest point of the slope, and did not look away. He wanted to see if the shape would move while he was watching, or if it only shifted when no one was paying attention. For 50 minutes, nothing changed. The ridgeline remained static. Then, in the final 10 minutes, he saw it. The shape rose. It did not rise quickly, but it rose unmistakably, lifting from a crouched or lowered position into something taller, something that broke the horizon line. It remained upright for less than a minute, then lowered again, sinking back into the ridge until it was indistinguishable from the slope. He called the others over and told them what he had seen. They did not question him. They had seen enough themselves to know that doubt was no longer useful. That evening they made a decision. They would attempt one more full day of surveying, focusing on the eastern sections of their assigned territory, away from the ridge. If the distortions continued, they would leave. If the shape appeared again, they would leave. There was no point in continuing work that could not be completed. The following morning they woke to find that the ridge was closer. Not metaphorically closer, not closer in the sense of feeling oppressive or threatening. Physically closer. The distance from their camp to the base of the slope had been approximately 300 yards. Now it was less than 200. The landmarks they had used to judge the distance, a cluster of boulders and a dry stream bed, were still in the same positions relative to the camp. The ridge had moved. They did not pack immediately. They stood at the edge of the clearing and stared at the slope, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. One of them suggested that they had misremembered the distance, that fatigue and stress had distorted their perception. Another pointed out that their notes clearly documented the original measurement. There was no misremembering. The ridge had moved, or something on the ridge had moved, and in moving, it had brought the slope with it. They packed in silence and relocated the camp another quarter-mile to the east. They did not discuss what had happened. They simply moved. The giant was too large to be anything else. That was what they began to call it, not in their official notes, but in the quiet conversations they had when they thought no one else was listening. The word felt absurd, but it was the only one that fit. It stood upright. That much was certain. The proportions were wrong for a bear, wrong for any animal they knew. The torso was broad and elongated. The limbs were thick, visible even from a distance. It did not move quickly. When it moved at all, it was with a slow, deliberate weight that seemed to shift the landscape around it. Its surface was not fur or skin in any familiar sense. It appeared rough, textured like weathered stone or compacted earth. In certain light, it seemed to blend into the hillside, as though it were made from the same material. But when it moved, the illusion broke. It had edges. It had shape. It was separate from the land, even if it resembled it. The surveyors never saw it up close. They never approached it intentionally. But they saw it often enough to understand its scale. When it stood at full height, it rose above the tree line. When it crouched or lowered itself, it became part of the ridge again, indistinguishable from the slopes around it. One of the men estimated that it was at least 30 feet tall, possibly more. Another said that estimation was meaningless because they had no reliable reference point. Distance itself had become unreliable. But they all agreed on one thing. It was too large to ignore, and too large to confront. It did not approach them. It did not descend from the high ground. It remained above, watching. The realization that it was watching them came gradually. At first they assumed it was simply occupying the same space they were working in, that its presence was coincidental. But as the days passed, they noticed patterns. It appeared when they began their work. It moved to match their position. When they relocated to a different section of the valley, it would appear on the ridge closest to them within hours. One surveyor tested this. He walked alone to the southern edge of their work area, far from where the rest of the crew was measuring. He waited. Within 20 minutes, he saw the shape rise on the southern ridge, directly above him. It had not been there before. It had followed him. He returned to camp and did not go out alone again. The giant's head, if it could be called that, was difficult to distinguish from the rest of its form. There was no clear division between the torso and what might have been a skull. The mass simply tapered upward, forming a blunt, rounded peak. But there were depressions in that mass, darker patches that might have been eyes, though they did not reflect light the way animal eyes did. They absorbed it. One of the surveyors described the experience of being looked at by those depressions. He said it was not like being seen by an animal or another person. It was like being assessed by something that did not think in familiar terms, something that measured him not as a threat or a curiosity, but as an intrusion. He said it made him feel small. Not in the physical sense, but in the sense of being fundamentally out of place. The others agreed. They all felt it. The giant's attention was not hostile, but it was absolute. When it looked at them, they knew. The sense of being observed was constant. It was not paranoia. It was not imagination. It was the simple, inescapable awareness that something was tracking their movements. The surveyors could feel it in the way the air seemed to press down on them when they worked near the ridge. They could feel it in the silence that followed them through the valley. They began to see it at different vantage points. In the morning, it would be on the western slope. By afternoon, it would be visible to the north. It never appeared in the same place twice in a single day, but it was always elevated, always positioned where it could see them clearly. They stopped trying to measure the ridge. They stopped trying to verify elevations or establish accurate distances. The work had become impossible, not because the land was too difficult, but because the giant's presence made consistency meaningless. Landmarks shifted. Distances changed. The hills themselves seemed to rearrange when they were not looking. One surveyor wrote in his field book that the giant was not hunting them. He was certain of that. If it had wanted to harm them, it could have. It was large enough, close enough. But it did not descend. It did not pursue. It simply remained above them, a constant, unmoving reminder that they were not alone. That was worse. The psychological weight of being watched without understanding why began to affect their work in ways that had nothing to do with measurement. They became cautious to the point of paralysis. Simple decisions, where to set up the transit, Which route to take through the valley, whether to work in the morning or wait until afternoon, became sources of anxiety. Every choice felt scrutinized. Every movement felt observed. One of the men began to lose his composure. He did not speak about it directly, but the others noticed. He would stop in the middle of a task and stare at the ridge for minutes at a time. He stopped eating regularly. He began to insist that they move the camp every night, convinced that staying in one place too long would draw the giant closer. The crew leader tried to reassure him, but there was no reassurance to offer. They were all feeling the same pressure. The only difference was how they expressed it. On the 8th day after they had first seen the giant move, one of the surveyors refused to leave the camp. He said he was ill, though he showed no symptoms. He simply sat by the fire and would not stand. The others did not force him. They understood. They were all close to the same breaking point. That afternoon, while the remaining crew members attempted to work in the eastern valley, the man who had stayed behind saw the giant descend partway down the slope. It did not come close to the camp. It stopped perhaps 100 yards above the tree line, lowered itself to what might have been a sitting position, and remained there. When the others returned and he told them what he had seen, they did not react with alarm. They reacted with resignation. The giant was no longer content to watch from the peaks. It was coming closer. Not quickly, not aggressively, but inevitably. They decided that night to leave at first light. The rules formed without discussion. No one gave orders. No one proposed a new protocol. The surveyors simply began to alter their behavior in ways that reduced their visibility, their exposure, their proximity to the ridgeline. They stopped working after mid-afternoon. The light was still good, the weather clear, but they returned to camp early and did not resume until the following morning. They did not explain why. They did not need to. They avoided high ground. When the terrain forced them upward, they moved quickly and did not pause. They no longer set up the transit on ridges or hilltops. They kept to the valleys, the depressions, the low places where they could not be easily seen from above. They moved their camp 3 times in 5 days, each time placing it in a location that offered cover rather than visibility. They chose clearings surrounded by trees, shallow gullies, areas where the land folded in on itself. They no longer prioritized access to water or flat ground. They prioritized concealment. They stopped speaking unnecessarily. Conversations became brief, functional. Instructions were given in low tones. No one raised their voice. No one laughed. The silence was not agreed upon, but it was absolute, and they stopped looking up. That was the hardest rule to follow, and the one they broke most often. The instinct to check, to see if the giant was still there, was overwhelming. But each time they looked, they saw it. And each time they saw it, the weight of its presence became harder to bear. The rules were not rational. They were instinctive, born from the same impulse that made animals go still in the presence of predators. The surveyors were not being hunted, but they were being dominated. The giant's presence imposed a hierarchy that they could not challenge. They were smaller. They were weaker. They were visitors in a place that was not theirs. One of the men wrote in his journal that the rules felt ancient, as though they were remembering something their ancestors had known. He wrote that fear, real fear, was not about immediate danger. It was about recognizing your place in an order you could not change. The giant had not threatened them. It had simply shown them where they stood, and they had accepted it. The rules kept them alive, though alive was perhaps not the correct word. They kept them functional. They kept them moving, but the cost was high. The men who left the western hills were not the same men who had arrived. They were quieter. They startled easily. They did not sleep well. And they did not speak about what they had seen, not because they had agreed to keep silent, but because there were no words that felt adequate. The day the scale changed, the surveyors were working in a narrow valley between 2 ridges. It was one of the few areas they had been able to measure with any consistency. The ground was level, the sightlines clear. They were making progress for the first time in over a week. Then the shadow fell. It was not gradual. It was sudden, as though something massive had moved between them and the sun. The temperature dropped. The light dimmed. The surveyors looked up. The giant was closer than it had ever been. It stood on the ridge to the south, less than 200 yards away. From that distance, they could see details they had not noticed before. The texture of its surface, which they had thought was stone, had variation. There were cracks, striations, patches that seemed darker or lighter depending on the angle. Its limbs were proportioned like a human's, but thicker, heavier, built to support a frame that should not have been able to stand. It was not moving. It was simply there, fully visible, undeniable. One of the surveyors dropped his measuring rod. The sound echoed in the silence. The giant did not react. It remained still, its posture slightly forward, as though it were leaning to see them more clearly. The ground beneath them trembled. It was faint, more a vibration than a true quake, but it was enough to make the men step back instinctively. Loose stones shifted. Dust rose in small clouds. The tremor lasted only a few seconds, but it confirmed what they had already suspected. The giant was not an illusion. It was not a distant shape they had misinterpreted. It was real, and it was too close. One of the surveyors, the youngest of the crew, began to back away slowly. The others followed. No one turned their back on the ridge. They moved in reverse, step by step, keeping their eyes on the giant. It did not follow. It did not move at all. But its presence was enough. The mass of it, the sheer physical reality of something that large standing that close, overrode every instinct except retreat. They reached the edge of the valley and kept moving. One of the men stumbled, caught himself, and continued. Another was breathing too fast, his chest heaving, though they had not been running. The crew leader, a man who had remained calm through every previous encounter, finally spoke. His voice was low and steady, but the words were final. "We are leaving, now." They gathered their equipment in silence and left the valley. They did not run, but their pace was faster than it had been in days. They returned to camp, packed what they could carry, and moved south, away from the ridges, away from the hills, away from the giant. They did not stop moving until they reached the settlement. That night, in the safety of the town, they sat in the common room of a boarding house and tried to put into words what they had experienced. They could not. Every description felt inadequate. Every explanation felt insufficient. One of them said simply that the hills were occupied and that no amount of money or obligation was worth returning. The others agreed. They drafted a letter to the surveying office, explaining that the Western Territory could not be mapped due to obstructions that exceeded their capacity to work around. They did not describe the giant. They did not need to. The letter was formal, brief, and final. They requested reassignment and stated that they would not return to the hills under any circumstances. The letter was accepted without question. The land was removed from their contract. Another crew was offered the work. They declined. The western hills were marked as deferred, and no further attempts were made to survey them. The land was left unmapped. That section of the western hills, along with several adjacent parcels, was marked as inaccessible in the final survey report. The designation was not unusual. Impassable terrain, unstable ground, and dense forestation often resulted in sections being deferred for future crews. But no future crews were ever sent. The surveyors submitted their notes and their measurements, such as they were. They included the sections they had completed and the sections they had not. They did not explain why certain areas had been excluded. They did not need to. The report was accepted without question. Years later, when the region was revisited for railroad expansion, the western hills were bypassed entirely. The route was adjusted to avoid them. No engineer questioned the decision. The land was simply noted as unsuitable. Maps from that era show the area in less detail than the surrounding terrain. Contour lines are sparse. Elevations are approximate. Some features are labeled with question marks, as though the cartographers were uncertain whether they belonged. The giant was never mentioned by name in any official document. But the absence of detail, the gaps in the maps, the quiet rerouting of development, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. The surveyors had encountered something that made their work impossible, and rather than confront it, they had simply left it alone. That decision was not cowardice. It was recognition. The men who had seen the giant understood that it was not something that could be measured, mapped, or managed. It was not an obstacle to be overcome. It was a boundary to be respected. And so the land remained undefined. Ownership was never established. Development was never attempted. The hills stood as they had stood for centuries, untouched, unrecorded, and undisturbed. The locals continued to avoid them. Hunters went elsewhere. Trappers set their lines in different valleys. When travelers asked about the western hills, they were told the same things the surveyors had been told. The ground was unreliable, the slopes were steep, the area was better left alone. No one ever said why, but everyone understood. What remained standing on the hills was never confirmed, never catalogued, never explained. The surveyors who filed the original claim did not return. They took other contracts in other regions and did not speak publicly about what they had seen. When asked, they described the work as difficult and the terrain as unreliable. They did not elaborate, but the land itself remembers. It remembers in the way it resists measurement, in the way it remains partially undefined on every map that includes it. It remembers in the absence of roads, the lack of settlement, the quiet understanding among those who live nearby that certain hills are better left alone. The giant did not descend. It did not attack. It did not need to. Its presence was enough. It marked the boundary not with violence, but with scale, with silence, with the simple, undeniable fact that it was there first. And in 1871, a group of surveyors learned that some borders are not drawn by men. Some borders are enforced by things that do not move, do not speak, and do not need to justify their claim. They simply stand, and the land around them adjusts. The hills remain, the maps remain incomplete. And somewhere in the Western Territory, on ridges that have no official name and elevations that were never recorded, something continues to stand. It does not move often. It does not need to. It has already made its position clear. The surveyors understood that. They understood that their work, their measurements, their maps, all of it was insignificant in the face of something that had occupied that ground long before borders and property lines existed. They understood that they had been allowed to leave, not because the giant was indifferent, but because they had recognized their place and chosen to respect it. That recognition saved them, and it shaped every decision that followed. The land was never developed. The hills were never claimed. The giant was never named in any record that survives, but it is there. It has always been there. And the absence on the maps, the gaps in the surveys, the quiet avoidance practiced by generations of people who live nearby, all of it serves as a reminder. Some places do not belong to us. Some borders are not ours to cross. And some things, vast and silent and patient, do not need to explain themselves. They simply remain, and we adjust.